Every season is spooky season in our book.
So settle in and prepare to be shook. You are listening to Shook, a comedic podcast about all things paranormal and unexplained.
I'm Sannah.
Hey friends, I'm Amanda, and fun fact, oh goodness, I feel like there's so many. I will just say my fun fact right now is that I am looking forward to celebrating Connolly's birthday this upcoming weekend. It's the big 4-0, so it's kind of a BD, a big deal. So yeah, and I realized this morning that the story I'm going to tell you all today actually coincides with today's date as we record.
Oh my God.
What is your fun fact, Sannah?
Okay, so my fun fact is actually a very fun fact to me. I don't know if it's a fun fact to anyone else, and I'm kind of hesitant to share it because I don't have a lot of information that I'm willing to share about it yet. But I would like to say, fun fact, I am writing a novel.
Ooh, I already knew that, but shock. I gotta fake the shock factor.
You don't know that I'm writing this one.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a different one.
Oh my God.
All I will tell you about it, I'm not going to tell you the genre yet because I don't want anyone getting any preconceived notions. But I will say it has themes that you see in the films Black Swan, Perfect Blue, and All About Eve. It has themes from Shakespeare.
So it has everything, is what you're saying?
It basically has everything. And so that genuinely is my fun fact that is fun to me. The only reason I was willing to say this as my fun fact is because I feel like once I say it here, I have to finish it.
Right.
Because I've said it on the podcast. So that will hold me accountable. Listeners, hold me accountable to finish this damn novel.
I'm excited.
Thank you, Hunt.
#1 fan.
Yeah.
Well, that's really awesome, and I'm excited for you, and I can't wait to read it. I also have been dying to ask you all week if you have watched the Fallout show with Ella Purnell.
No, I haven't yet. And
neither.
I really want to, and I hope to tonight. Anyways, I believe you go first this week. So, what story had you shook?
So, the story that had me shook this week is the tragedy of the Titanic and the resulting hauntings of various Titanic museums across the United States.
Oh my God.
And before I dive in, I've literally spent days on this, and there is so much to this whole story that it would probably be mathematically impossible for me to get every single thing. Plus, there's hearsay out there as well. So,
Oof.
that being said, please don't roast me too hard. I did my best. There's a lot of information, and real quick, if you want a super deep dive into this story, highly recommend Time Suck with Dan Cummins. I love that man. He's amazing. My husband and I binge him every time we go on the road anywhere. He did an episode about the Titanic, and that episode, for anybody interested, is episode 208. It's from 2020, I think, so you'll have to dig in the archives. But he did a great deep dive. So if you want more Titanic after this, come on. The RMS Titanic was a British ocean liner operated by the White Star Line, which was owned by the famous American banker J.P. Morgan. Ever heard of him? Morgan purchased the White Star Line for $32 million in 1902. That's a lot of money. And real quick, fun fact about JP Morgan. He was supposed to be aboard the Titanic, but he canceled his plans. Yep. Last minute, he canceled his plans. So, of course, that fueled one of several conspiracy theories regarding the Titanic. I'm not going to get into the rabbit holes of all the conspiracy theories because that would be an extra 45 minutes of me telling you all this stuff. But yeah, so the Titanic, the largest and most luxurious ship of its time, was said to be unsinkable, and no one questioned the ship's structural integrity as it set sail just after noon on April 10th, 1912. Unfortunately, its maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City in April of 1912 would be its last. After 11 p.m. on April 14th, and that was where the fun fact lies, Today is April 14th as we record.
Oh.
112 years ago today, as we record this, a gigantic iceberg weighing several tons was seen by lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee in the crow's nest of the Titanic. But it was too late. Despite efforts to steer the Titanic away, the iceberg that was thought to have come from a glacier in Greenland, it made contact, digging into the ship's starboard side for approximately 8 seconds. In a matter of seconds, that scraping obliterated enough compartments that the Titanic began to take on several tons of water at a very rapid rate. Women and children were then told to board the limited supply of lifeboats, leaving many behind. In the early morning of April 15th, 1912, the iceberg caused the Titanic to split in half after part of the ship raised above the water surface vertically, and ultimately it sank to its watery grave at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. 1,517 people from all over the world lost their lives due to drowning and hypothermia in the ocean's 28-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Until the end, the band played. The song playing as the Titanic slipped under the ocean surface was Nearer My God to Thee. This awful accident marked the deadliest ship disaster of its time and one of humanity's greatest tragedies in centuries. Several hours after the Titanic sank, a ship called the Carpathia would rescue the survivors. Of the deceased, more than 520 were third-class passengers, 161 were second class, and 123 first class. Additionally, nearly 700 brave crew members lost their lives in an effort to slow down its sinking. Of course, the story of the Titanic was always very famous, but it was made even more famous by the 1997 James Cameron film Titanic. Ever heard of it? Okay, here we go. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this tragedy for me was obviously the families and couples who got separated during the event. And one of those families I'm about to tell you about. Co-owner of Macy's department store, Isidore Strauss, and his wife, Ida Strauss, refused to be separated when Ida was offered a boat. Ida reportedly said, "Where you go, I go," and they perished together at sea.
Oh my God. Because if she had taken the lifeboat, he would have died and she would have just been like so sad for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
The Titanic was so stupid. Like, it makes me so mad sometimes when I think about it. Senseless tragedy.
Yeah, it is very senseless. And we're going to get into a lot of stuff. Hopefully, I cover some things that you don't even know yet, because there were some things that I was like, what? Excuse me? Excuse me? But yeah, so Ida and Isidore, I'm pretty sure that they were probably the main inspiration for Jack and Rose, who were fictional characters portraying a similar situation. So, a bit more about the ship itself before I dive into the creepy stuff. The Titanic was built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1909, and on its 1912 voyage was operated by Captain Edward John Smith. It is believed that Smith died at his post, although his body was never found. In any case, he literally went down with this ship, and I respect him for that. It had to have been awful. Real quick fun fact that I didn't even include in my notes. He was supposed to be retired. I've heard conflicting things that either this was supposed to be his last ship he captained before retirement, or he briefly came out of retirement to take on this trip and he fucking
Because
died.
it was so hyped up.
Yeah.
Probably. Either way, damn. I hate irony sometimes, most of the time.
Right. So the Titanic, she was a big gal. She boasted 10 decks, was a whopping 882 feet and 9 inches long, and had a maximum width of 92 feet and 6 inches.
Guess that's why they call it the Titanic.
She's a titan. Some would say, prior to the accident, that this ship had everything. Some of the world's wealthiest people were aboard this ship, and it was pretty much all the rage. The passengers enjoyed a reception room, luxury accommodations for first class passengers, rooms, of course, for the second and third class passengers, writing and reading rooms, exquisite dining rooms, a smoking lounge, a gym with traditional machinery, and also equipment for equestrians. I found out that apparently they had some sort of machinery in this gym that was meant to keep the glutes and other muscles needed for riding a horse like in tip-top shape so they wouldn't lose muscle mass and get back on that horse again when it was time. I thought
Wow.
that was kind of cool. They also had a beautiful upper deck with views of the ocean as far as the eye could see. Basically, you name it. It was simply unprecedented at the time. So I said the ship had everything. We know that that's not the case. Let's just say mistakes were made. And I'm going to name a few of those mistakes. While the Titanic did have life jackets, they were poorly crafted. And although there were lifeboats, there simply were not enough. There was supposed to be a lifeboat drill prior to takeoff, but it ended up being called off for some unknown reason. On top of the lack of lifeboats and the standard life jackets, there was also a pretty major delay in communication to passengers and crew about the severity of the situation at hand. Because of the nature of the collision, basically it scraped along. It did not make as loud of a noise as people would expect when you say, oh my God, we hit an iceberg. Surviving passenger Eloise Smith, she stated, there was no communication, no panic, and no one seemed to be particularly frightened. Some passengers were enjoying themselves in the dining hall, or on the dance floor, or in their rooms, completely oblivious to the iceberg accident at play. Not only that, there were several ice warnings from other ships that were either miscommunicated, underestimated, or simply ignored for whatever reason. And they had communication with several other ships that were out in the Atlantic. They were pretty far away, but they were giving warnings to each other, and sometimes the message did not get to the appropriate folks in time. Additionally, iron rivets were used in portions of the ship, which was way less sturdy than the steel that they used in the rest of the ship. In fact, it's estimated to be about 30% less strong, less sturdy than the steel. And apparently, iron is, at least back then, was pretty notorious for becoming even extra brittle in cold temperatures. And one thing about that ocean, it was code. The bulkheads, which separated each compartment at the bottom of the ship, they were designed in such a way that only the bow, really, would be able to handle a head-on collision. The bulkheads up front, they were tall, and as they went along the side of the ship, they got smaller and smaller. And since the Titanic basically slid against the middle, they were pretty much doomed, as the water started to pour in several tons a minute. Something that makes this even crazier is that prior to its voyage, at one point there was a fire on the ship down where they kept the coal, and it just so happens to be pretty aligned with where the ship made contact to the iceberg.
So it
Or
was like an
with,
already weakened spot, I guess.
yes. So if you look at photographs of the Titanic, you can actually see what looks to be a smudge on the starboard side where it made contact. And I don't know if it's exactly the same spot, but it was enough to probably have been weakened by that fire. Also, several of the first round of lifeboats that were deployed were only about 50 to 60% full. And that was because of the only women and children rule. Obviously, there's so much chaos going on. The people who get it, the people who realize the severity of the situation, they're fighting tooth and nail to get their husbands with them, obviously. In fact, I heard one story. There was a man who actually got to stay with his daughter, and it's only because she saved his life by throwing a temper tantrum.
She was like, I want my daddy.
Yeah, I want my daddy.
I'm sorry, Hunty, not to interrupt, but you just reminded me of that time that Connolly said that Grandpa Joe would be the guy that demands to get on the lifeboat in front of all the women and children.
Oh, absolutely. We're actually going to talk about somebody who's not Grandpa Joe. FYI, guys, go on Reddit and go to Grandpa Joe Hate. Those who get it, get it. But if you've seen the Chocolate Factory movies, Willy Wonka, all that, you know that Grandpa Joe, he was a faker. And that's all I'm going to say.
He was out for himself.
He was. He was. He said, I did this one for me, and also that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and that
I'm
one.
doing all of these for me.
I'm doing all of this for me. Absolutely. But yeah, we're going to talk about somebody similar to Grandpa Joe here in a little bit. Even before the ship sailed, on top of that fire that happened, 8 workers lost their lives during the construction from various accidents. One guy was just simply minding his own business, walking to his station where a giant piece of wood fell on him and he died. And that's just one of the ways that people died in construction. I take that perhaps as an omen for bad luck.
Yeah.
That and the fire, it's kind of like the universe is telling
Final
you,
destination. Shit.
pump the brakes. Right. It's pretty crazy. And finally, here's the kicker, Sannah. I did not realize this. The lookouts did not have binoculars due to a miscommunication. Basically, there was a man who was supposed to be on the ship and he was supposed to supply the binoculars.
They should have just named this ship Cutting Corners.
Yes, cutting corners.
Titanic who?
Yeah. Oh my God. Like for real though, for real. So about a month later, in May of 1912, a British inquiry was held to determine who or what was at fault for the disaster. Ultimately, there were so many factors that I just listed, and probably more, that were at play that caused the devastation. However, I want to point out, Sannah, J. Bruce Ismay, who signed off on the Titanic in the most cowardly way, took a lifeboat before others, and was rightfully ostracized for the rest of his life for his selfish actions.
He one-manned a lifeboat, seriously?
Yep. And allegedly, in his backpedaling, was like, there wasn't anybody near me when I got on the boat, so I thought, first come, first serve. Nobody no. There's no women here. I'm just going to take it. No.
That just gave me the ick.
Yeah. Yeah. So, 73 years after she sank, American oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard discovered the Titanic's final resting place, and later, several artifacts would be collected from the depths. Several artifacts were auctioned, and others now reside in some of those Titanic museums that I told you about across the US. Now, let's get into some of these hauntings. I am discussing the following museums: the Titanic exhibit in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee.
Yeah.
Also going to talk about the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri. And finally, the Titanic exhibit in Las Vegas, Nevada. I do want to point out that in watching various YouTube videos of people exploring these things, they seem to have a standard. Obviously, they all went by the blueprints to make it pretty much identical to what people would have experienced on the ship. A lot of the exhibits inside of it where you can do interactive things, those are all in, it seems to be in every single one that I looked at. And I looked at several YouTubers, and I also rewatched one of my favorite Ghost Adventures episodes ever, their covering of the Titanic. OmarGoshTV and OmarGosh Vlogs, his YouTube channels. I talked about him in a previous episode. It may have been the Crescent Hotel one, I'm not sure, but he's got a really great show. So Omar and his wife Tiffany, they went to the haunted Branson, Missouri Titanic Museum, which is full of artifacts, like I said, and on their trip, they captured some paranormal evidence. At one point, Omar and his wife were all alone when the steering wheel replica starts spinning on its own, and there's literally not a soul. It literally just goes round and back again. Omar and Tiffany decide to have a spirit box session in a secluded area of the museum, and they capture several voices that say the following. I'm just going to rattle them off. Omar, edge, the ship, wait in line, buried, boat, dad, he drowned, died, mom, seek heaven, get back, and several more names, of which were posted on the wall that named the victims and survivors. So he also went to the Vegas Titanic exhibit, and he posted that video on his OmarGoshTV channel. In this exhibit, like I said, there were exact replicas of the rooms based on which class you were in. You can see artifacts from the Titanic and headshots of passengers who lost their lives. And they even have QR codes, and this seems to be the standard. When you walk in, you're assigned a passenger slip with a name of one of the passengers, and you find out at the end of the tour if your name lived or died. And it has a QR code that lets you look that up. Some paranormal experiences that people have had there. They see dark figures that roam the Titanic replica hallways. I want to say he may have done another voice box session there as well, but those are the main takeaways from that. Also, I want to shout out the YouTube channel called The Paranormal Files. This video is about the Pigeon Forge Titanic Museum. An anonymous woman who works there told the YouTuber named Colin that she has seen full-bodied apparitions, then started rattling off other experiences at the museum. She said, There is a very tall, demonic-looking man in the interactive part of the building. There was a second-class passenger that saw me twice. Then this room in the background, there was a lady's voice who came over and said, "We're here," on the stairs. I was by myself inside when he grabbed me on the bridge, and I saw a shadow man on the promenade deck. There's a little girl that plays hide and seek in the children's gallery with a lot of us, not just me. And she also likes watching the movie in the movie gallery. Children laughter by the stairs, and there's also been a little boy in suspenders and a white button down who just likes to be on the case downstairs. So the anonymous employee goes on to mention that in addition to the artifacts, there are also several mirrors that face each other in the exhibit to give the illusion that the halls just keep on going. But she believes that because the mirrors are facing each other, portal. This also seems to be standard in these exhibits. I don't know if they're owned by the same company. I should have looked that up, but they're all pretty standard and they all have those mirrors. Colin, the YouTuber, he also goes off on his own to explore the museum and he pulls out his spirit talker device. It spits out all these words like get out and Carl. Later, he would discover that 2 passengers were named Carl with a K. So Colin also picked up other names. He picked up the name Ethel and Dorothy, which were also the names of a couple of the Titanic passengers. And I think it's really cool that the Spirit Talker box thing picked up names that were actually relevant to the time. Like Ethel,
Yeah.
that's a perfect example of a name from the time.
That gives it some credibility.
Yeah, definitely. The Spirit Talker app that he was using, it also spits out the words deep, can't breathe, help me, there's a scream, and need help. So those are 3 of the channels that I looked at for evidence. And of course, I said I rewatched the Ghost Adventures episode, the one that takes place in Branson, Missouri. Now, this one, I mean, obviously it makes most sense for me to go to Pigeon Forge because it's not that far. But if I had to pick out of all of these, I would want to go to the Branson, Missouri one. So Zach Bagans interviews a tour guide there, and she states that in the famous grand staircase, we've all seen it, she saw the apparition of who she believes to be the spirit of John Jacob Astor, the owner of Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and was the richest man aboard the Titanic, and not just the Titanic, like in the world. Despite his wealth and social status, he was one of the very many unlucky souls who died during the sinking. Another tour guide explained that the promenade deck freaks her out the most, which has been common. Most people in these exhibits hate the promenade deck. It gives them the heebie-jeebies. One night, this tour guide, she said that while alone in the area on the promenade deck and cleaning the windows, she noticed children's handprints on the side of the window that she had just cleaned. So she went on the outside of it, wiped it all down, checked her shit, it was good, comes back around, does the other side, and lo and behold, there's a child-sized hand. Mind you, she's by herself. Nobody's there. Everybody's gone. She's just cleaning, trying to get out. She's trying to clock out and go home. She had just cleaned it, goes back over it. As she explains this to Zach, another set of handprints appears on the glass. Zach and the crew grab their SLS camera and detect an anomaly inches away from the window by the guardrail. Seemingly, it's just going through the window, like it's jumping out. They also capture what looks like a set of handprints after the anomaly passes through, again with those handprints. Aaron and Billy, they set out some cookies and some other sweets for the child spirit that's believed to haunt the museum, and they asked the obelisk the gender and the age of the spirit, and the box reads female, then 6. And that's just like the cliff notes of that episode. There's a lot of cool stuff, but I just didn't want to get too long-winded with this. But I did want to say I discovered a YouTube channel called Top Discovery Channel, and the video is called 15 Terrifying Things That Were Found at the Titanic. Obviously, there were human remains. There was an 18-karat gold locket that belonged to a first-class passenger named Victoria Estelle McDowell Clark. That's a long name. She and her husband took the Titanic to get back home to the U.S. They had just celebrated their honeymoon. Virginia survived, but her husband did not. This couple is thought to be another inspiration for Rose and Jack from the Titanic film. There was also a little girl who was aboard named Eva Hart. Eva Hart's favorite doll's head sank to the bottom of the ocean, was recovered 65 years later, and a collector named Teresa kept her. Eva died in 1996 and never saw her doll again. There were also vials of Edwardian perfume that were collected. There was a set of keys, And there was also a custom pair of cufflinks that actually had the Titanic painted on them, which I thought was super cool. And I imagine back in the day you had to have hella money to acquire something like that. Like, that's super custom. Also, they found the warning bell that was rang by Frederick Fleet to alert the passengers of the iceberg's crash. That was also found in the wreckage. There was a handwritten account of the lifeboat recovery. This disturbing note details how, when trying to recover one of the lifeboats that partially submerged, a writer saw dead bodies in life jackets, as well as the corpse of a man in a nice dinner jacket. He also was wearing a wedding ring. The hull and the stern of the Titanic was also recovered, and when observing the remains of the ship, you can see the holes that corroborate the story of how the ship broke in half after it went, I think it was like a 45-degree angle. Pretty crazy. Also found were numerous letters and postcards detailing what was going on in the lives of these passengers, their plans for the future, and experiences aboard the ship. Also found was a pair of binoculars from the crow's nest of the ship. The lookouts never used those binoculars, as I said, because they were locked away in a cubby. Can you imagine how just that one simple thing could have avoided this whole thing? Because when they say iceberg dead ahead, at that point it is already too late. Because when the waters are so calm and there's no waves crashing upon any mass in the ocean like an iceberg or a growler, it's pretty easy to miss it. Like, you really have to be looking, and from a great distance, because they don't say tip of the iceberg for nothing. When you look under the water, it's a giant mass that protrudes way farther than you would expect. And in their turning, at the time that they did, instead of hitting the head-on compartments that were suited for a collision, they ended up scraping with what was probably under the water that they couldn't see. I mean, if they were only able to see it in time, it's just mind-boggling to me. Also, remember the musicians. Musician Wallace Hartley's violin was also found. He was in the
Mm.
band that played until the ship went under. And when it was discovered, his fiancée received it, and she sold it in an auction.
I am going to cry.
I know. So, like, the crew members too, like, I watched a documentary. I didn't really include that much in my research because it's more of an artistic reenactment of what happened. These crew members, bless their hearts, they literally fought tooth and nail to do everything that they could, not to save the ship because they knew they were doomed, but they wanted to make sure as many people as possible could get off in time. And so they did everything they could to slow down the progression of the water seeping into the different compartments. And in doing so,
At their own detriment.
died. Yeah. You contrast that with what's his face getting in a freaking lifeboat when he's partially at fault for the whole thing. And then he wants to say, oh, I couldn't bear to look at her. And so he turned away. But then you've got people who literally died on the ship with bravery.
He can go to hell. He probably is. Also, the people that worked down in the bottom of the ship, like,
They were pushing things up against the ship to cover any holes, but obviously that it's tons of water pressure. In this one documentary I saw, there were documentations of best friends that were in this together that had falling outs during all of this, because it's like a high stressful situation, obviously. And then riding their women, or, you know, riding their wives and their girlfriends at home. Like, they said at one point in that reenactment series that the captain, oh my God, he gave them the option near the end, saying, you can stay down here and try to slow down the progression of the sinking, or you can come up to the deck for safety. And so many of them decided that they were going to go down with the ship too. In the crew's efforts of trying to prolong the event, they saved about an hour to an hour and a half of
oh my God.
of time. I know.
No, Hunty. No, because it means that it wasn't in vain completely, but like, it just is so sad. Our society and how it's structured and hierarchy, and they were the lowest people on the totem pole.
You look at the first class, more people survive than not, and then it goes down and down and down the lower you
Yeah.
go. And that is the sad fact about our society.
Ugh, the Titanic makes me so sad. I remember when I was like 7 years old, that's when the movie came out. And after I saw the movie, I became obsessed with it. And so, like, I would go to the library and just like check out any book about the Titanic I possibly could, and kind of ruminated on it a lot. Like, as a kid,
Yeah.
it was kind of weird. I would get myself real upset.
Oh, yeah, I was purposefully hurting my own feelings all the time. I rewatched that movie so many times, and also there's an older black and white version of the movie I watched that with my
Oh,
nanny a couple
wow.
times at the old house. Freaking bawled my eyes out. When you're watching these documentaries, these reenactments, you're watching the films about it, you put yourself in their shoes to know that death is imminent. It sounds so dramatic to say, we're all gonna die, but literally, we're all gonna die at some point. But to know that it's coming and to know that there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, especially for those who were in the bottom of the ship as the water was rising. That's the most excruciating part to me. Them just the moment where they realize that they are trapped.
Yeah,
That makes me like panic
yeah. It gives
just
me
thinking
chills.
about it. It's just so many horrible ways to die. And then I
Mm-hmm.
also always think about that one scene from the Titanic movie where it's like this old couple and they know what's about to happen and they choose to stay in their beds and sleep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I had been on the Titanic with Connolly, I would not get on a lifeboat.
Oh my
I
God,
couldn't do
no.
it. I couldn't do it. Researching this forced me to consider my own morality, my own mortality. What would I do in that situation? And yeah, it's really thrilling to think, oh, I could survive this and have a story to tell forever and ever. But
Yeah.
what good is that if you don't have the love of your life with you?
I don't even know what I would do as a single individual with no fucks to give. Like, honestly, like, what would I do?
Just really quick, I do want to tell you about some survivors that I looked at that were like in their 90s. But two more things that were aboard the ship. This is my story. This is me wrapping it up. There was a wool vest that was belonging to a third class passenger named William Henry Allen that was among the wreckage, and it's now on display in one of those museums. And last but not least, the keys of Samuel Ernesto Hemming was also discovered, and those keys sold for $26,400. But I did see interviews that took place in the 1970s with survivors of the Titanic who mostly were babies when it happened. Um, there was one gentleman that actually survived that pretty much said that he fell off of, I guess, the bow, stern, whatever, of the ship when it was up in the air. And he luckily fell into the water without hitting any bodies, a boat, killing someone. And he just so happened to fall next to a boat and he was able to come to safety. And the interviewer was like, what's it like talking about this so many years later? And it was like you could see the PTSD in his face. Like, I don't want to talk about, like,
Survivor's
why am I?
guilt, too.
Yeah. Oh my God, the survivor's guilt has got to be insane. But yeah, that's my story of the Titanic and some of the haunting things that happen in these museums. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm sorry that was really long.
That's okay.
What story had you shook this week?
So, the story that had me shook this week comes from the latest edition of The Feminine Macabre, Volume 6, just came out. So, Monique from Fright Life Paranormal, one of the podcasts that we got to meet at the Oregon Ghost Conference, she has a story in the latest edition of Feminine Macabre called The Haunted Girl of Amherst. And it's really interesting. I thought about doing it today. The only reason I didn't is because the one I'm doing today has a familiar face in there. Someone I haven't
Ooh.
talked about in a while.
Is it Harry Houdini?
Maybe.
Oh my God.
And it's only a cameo cuz you know, like we've established, he makes cameo appearances in a lot of ghost things that occurred during the turn of the century. So he's in here a little bit. So, the actual story that had me shook from the Feminine Macabre, Volume 6, is called Rose Mackenberg's Mystical Medium Tour.
Ooh, I like that.
Any opportunity for me to talk about a tour,
A tour.
so I can say it in that voice.
Yeah.
360 Tour. So, Rose Mackenberg's Mystical Medium Tour is a story written by Shannon Ballinger. Rose Mackenberg was an established private investigator who specialized in debunking mediums because she was witnessing a lot of scamming going on, a lot of people getting taken advantage of. So she would have people actually call in her services to like go undercover and visit these mediums and see if she can pull one over on them. without
Mm-hmm.
them realizing it. And then her, of course, getting all the evidence she needs to know that they are fake. So Rose Mackenberg began working with Harry Houdini in 1924. At that point, he needed someone to go in his place to investigate these allegedly fraudulent mediums and practitioners of seemingly unexplained phenomena. He just needed someone who was unsuspecting, because he was so famous at that point for being someone who was out here actively debunking people left and right, you know? So
Right.
if Harry Houdini shows up on your doorstep, you better put on a
Yeah.
show or just forget it, because he's going to figure out how you did your trick, okay? And he's going to call you out in his show, and that's what he did. So he had this whole thing where, like, whenever he would put on a show, he would actually expose different mediums with very specific information that Rose
Oh.
and other people that worked for him would go and figure out. And so, yeah, it was very much like XOXO Gossip Girl. Like, he was out here exposing people left and right. So prior to meeting Houdini, I already kind of said this, but Rose was already an accomplished private investigator in the spiritualism community. They met when she approached Houdini for advice on a case she was working on at the time. Directors of a bank had hired her because they suspected that one of their employees had been using a local medium to get investment advice from spirits and was then following that advice. After this initial meeting, she became a member of Houdini's Secret Service, which consisted of investigators, journalists, showbiz colleagues, and a trusted medium. This team of experts would help him find fraudulent practitioners that Houdini would then expose publicly during his shows. This team would go ahead of Houdini to the city he was performing in next and begin their hunt. So, like, basically, Houdini was on a tour, and so Rose and other people would just get there a few days before he would roll into
Mm-hmm.
town and already be finding all the mediums
Mm-hmm.
and just digging their claws into the situation. When Rose was preparing to investigate in a new city, she did the absolute most. She
Oh.
observed the popular fashions of that city and dressed accordingly so as to blend in. She developed characters with funny names like Frances Odd, which was supposed to be like her take on fraud, and
Oh.
Alice Bunk, which was her way of saying all is bunk. She did multiple names like that. Like, she all of her names had some kind of like funny little undertone, and she often played the role of a widow who had recently lost her husband because she had noticed the pattern of predatory mediums targeting widows, as they usually had just come into some life insurance money that they may be willing to spend to hear a message from their lost love. This was very, very common. Rose was very successful in these undercover operations, in part because she was the last person you would pick in a lineup if you had to play Spot the PI. She played the part. The
She
Oscar
did.
goes to. During Houdini's shows, he would call upon Rose or other members of the team to come up and share their findings to prove they had, in fact, visited the medium that was being exposed in that particular instance. After 1926, the year of Houdini's death, Rose continued investigating mediums and uncovering their tricks. She declared, "The most vicious criminals in America are charlatans who betray and plunder their heartsick victims in the name of the dear departed dead." She wanted to spread awareness so people could have better discernment when considering turning to mediums in desperate times. To be clear, Rose was not anti spiritualism and had a great respect for those who found peace in the practice. She just couldn't stand seeing it be exploited the way it rampantly was. In an interview with E.W. Williamson of the Chicago Tribune in 1945, she said, "Many sincere spiritualists, including mediums, believe in life after death and are constantly seeking proof. But these do not practice trickery for gain or give advice on business deals and romances. It is only when I have found what was supposed to be psychic turned into extortion that I have condemned and exposed it." So she's not out here just trying to ruin everybody's business model.
Yeah.
But if she sees you taking $1,000 for a reading, She's coming for you. So, Rose was open to the existence of legitimate mediums, but said that she had yet to meet one. Rose was called to be an expert witness in the state of Pennsylvania twice. Once in 1937 for an inheritance dispute in which the deceased had left a sizable fortune to the Silver Bell Spiritualist Camp, and again in 1940 regarding a similar dispute with the benefactor being Lilydale Assembly in New York. And in both of those cases, I think it was the children of the deceased were expecting an inheritance, but that money was given to those spiritualist organizations, and they were in
Oh.
court trying to fight for their inheritance. And so they brought in Rose to like be their expert witness on how these people operate, and she was able to help them. So as early as 1942, a new demographic was being targeted, not just your run-of-the-mill widow. Distraught families of soldiers lost or killed during the war were the new target of these mediums.
Oh.
Some mediums were charging up to $1,000 for a message from a dead son or spouse. Highway fucking robbery, bro.
Mm-mm.
The families of those who died ended up getting some kind of like money for that, you know?
Girl, you need to watch Late Night with the Devil. This story you're telling reminds me of that. I just watched it. It's so good.
I've
Sorry,
been
didn't mean
wanting
cut you
to.
off.
It's on Shudder, isn't it?
Ooh,
It
I
looks
think it
really
is.
good. It was during this time that she and Chicago Tribune journalist E.W. Williamson embarked on what the essay calls the Mystical Medium Tour around Chicago. This was an effort of investigative journalism in which Rose was Williamson's liaison into the world of fraudulent mediums, and this adventure proved to be very enlightening for him to witness firsthand. Okay, so I'm about to read the next two passages in this book because there is a lot of dialogue and procedural information that
Gotcha.
is just best read from the horse's mouth because, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
it makes the most sense. So I'm about to tell y'all about the Mystical Medium Tour and what went down. So E.W. Williamson and Rose began visiting mediums all over Chicago, posing as a couple. Dressed as a nondescript housewife, Rose inspected her partner's attire before every visit. She insisted he loosen his tie, unbutton his collar, and leave his hat and coat at the office. Why? I don't know, wrote Williamson. It seemed to work. The first gathering they attended together was a service held at the Midland Hotel. A 25-cent donation was collected from each of the 30 attendees in exchange for a slip of paper to write a question for the medium. Rose instructed Williamson to write, "George, are you still suffering? When are you coming home?" and sign the slip, "Dan." Rose wrote on her slip, "Walter, have you seen Bill? Is he with you?" and signed it, "Florence."
I love this woman.
She's an icon, TBH. I think if she wasn't in an honest profession, she would be some kind of con artist herself.
Yeah.
Because she really likes going undercover.
Yeah.
She's good
It's
at
giving
it.
can't bullshit a bullshitter vibes. Like,
Yep.
yeah.
She's like, this isn't my first rodeo, okay? And it won't be the last either.
Nope.
After the requisite singing of hymns and what Williamson called some desultory talk about spiritualism, a healer took to the stage, and after a laying on of hands, declared 2 children healed. Williamson noticed that the spirits had been kind to the healer. She wore diamonds on both hands. After the healing, a collection basket was passed. Rose nudged Williamson and said, "Give him $1." They noticed these things. Wondering if the Tribune auditor would stand for it, Williamson reluctantly dropped a dollar bill into the basket. When the medium came to Williamson's question, "George, are you still suffering? When are you coming home?" she immediately declared George happy. The medium began to ask questions, which Williamson was slow to realize were attempts at cold reading. She told him she saw someone with a paintbrush and then asked about an architect. Williamson drew blanks on these questions, but when the medium told him she was getting a message from someone named Martha, Rose reminded him that Martha was his sister. Martha, the medium said, seemed agitated. Williamson acknowledged that that was a characteristic of Martha, which is like so not like they're just like fucking with her. That's your sister,
so
remember? Remember your sister, Martha.
That's
Martha,
just
who?
a characteristic of her.
Quickly changing the subject, she said she was getting a message from a spirit called Isabel. Rose told her that Bill had a sweetheart named Isabel. When the medium said to her that Grandpa was calling and asked if something was wrong with his side, Rose obligingly recalled a tree falling on Grandpa.
Oh.
I just remembered a tree fell on Grandpa that one time. So that checks out.
That's it. Yeah.
That does resonate. George, Martha, Walter, Bill, Isabel, and the unfortunate grandpa were all fictitious. That same evening, they attended a meeting at the Studebaker Theater. When they entered, the medium, a buxom, gray-haired woman with a schoolgirl complexion, clad in a flowing white gown, stood at a lectern reading aloud from a large book. The room was crowded, and Rose and Williamson could not find two seats together. Williamson noted that the audience, like their previous gathering, and those they would attend later, was primarily middle-aged and elderly women. He recognized two people in the auditorium from the earlier event at the Midland Hotel. The medium continued to read from the book, something about Jeremiah, in a low voice occasionally drowned out by traffic noise. When she finished her readings, she led the audience in the requisite hymn singing and announced the collection. Again, Williamson dropped a dollar bill in the basket, but noticed later he was the only one who had. The lights were turned off, and the group was instructed to sit quietly with their hands in their laps, palms up, and concentrate on attracting the spirit forces. The audience sat in silence for some minutes, waiting. Williamson remarked that nothing happened during that time except his ear itching, and he was afraid to scratch it and disturb the spirits. When the lights were turned on, the medium stepped into the audience and began giving readings. Upon reaching Rose, she held her hand for a few seconds and told her she saw a young man with the vibration of a sun who gave the name Walter. Walter, she told Rose, was very happy. She then passed on a message from Bill, a nephew who was a soldier or a sailor, telling Rose he had died suddenly after a sharp pain in his stomach. Rose, demonstrating the acumen she'd picked up in her decades of experience, asked the medium what Walter wanted her to do with the insurance money.
Of course that's what they said.
Yeah, because Rose is like, I wonder what she's going to say. Without missing a beat, the medium explained that it was too crowded to receive a clear message and suggested a private meeting the following Wednesday afternoon. When they met up after the readings, Rose told Williamson that if she had attended the recommended private reading, there was little doubt that as a grieving mother, she would have been advised to contribute a significant amount of the insurance money to support the cause. So she didn't end up going to the private reading, but she had already been through this scenario so many times that she knew that's the woman was trying to get her alone to influence her. So Rose then directed Williamson to an area she had discovered to be the center of the voodoo school of the occult, replete with spirit incense and love charms. Posing again as a married couple, they made an appointment with a medium that was using the name Madame O'Brain. Yes, O'Brain. It says, lest his readers believe the spelling is a typographical error, Williamson wrote, if you don't believe it, you can look it up in the phone book under All Nations True Gospel Holy Temple, Church Number 2. Madame O'Brain. Oh my God. They met Madame O'Brain in a back room of the vividly painted storefront temple that had been fitted up crudely as a chapel with a battered honky-tonk piano at one side. They paid $2 for a reading. The medium sensed that they were troubled in their minds. She informed them that they had one son who was dead and another son in the army who, she saw, would be discharged within the month. He looks like you, she told them without disclosing which of them he looked like.
It's the vagueness for me.
Yeah. He looks like you. She then told them that she perceived that they were bewitched because someone had put a spell on them. After seeing them appear satisfactorily horrified, She promised them she could take care of the bewitchment. She provided them with a prescription involving salt, red pepper, and vinegar, and instructions to mix it while reciting, "Whosoever has bewitched our luck, or wished any evil around me, let it return to the ones who did it. Give me peace of mind, health, and plenty of money. Amen." Explaining she was out of the required St. Anthony candles, she sold them 2 yellow candles, which she called Visualite candles, and assured them they were nearly as good. Following their visit to the All Nations True Gospel Holy Temple, they visited a second medium who, despite her full appointment book, was eager to squeeze them in because just after Rose had called for an appointment, Williamson's father had appeared and dictated a message to her in spirit writing. She also informed them she had been a medium for 40 years and gave 50 readings a day, in addition to her career in government work that required her to travel a great deal. When asked if she did materializations, she answered indignantly, "Do I? I am a master medium," she told them. "I use a trance. I'm a transfer medium." A significant part of her practice was the sale of spirit incense and oils. "Without warning," writes Williamson, "she smeared some of the highly perfumed spirit oil on my forehead, mumbling an incantation, and for good measure, some on my necktie." By the end of the visit, Rose and Williamson had purchased a jar of spirit incense to attract the proper guides for $2.50, lover's incense to promote harmony and banish evil spirits for $2.50, a vial of spirit oil to help promote spirit vibrations for $1, and one genuine St. Anthony candle with instructions to write a wish, place it under the candle, and burn 1 notch a day for $1. Examining the jar of lover's incense they had purchased, Williamson observed a microscopic "alleged" appears at the top of the label, so that the complete label reads, "Alleged Lover's Brand Incense, allegedly." They had that put up there really tiny to, like, I guess, protect their liability legally, so that if someone comes back at them and is like, "This didn't work," they can be like, "Well, it says alleged, so
Allegedly, ibuprofen.
maybe you should have read the packaging before you purchased it." I don't know.
Yeah.
Sounds like a you problem. The tour of Chicago area mediums continued. In a converted basement chapel, the next medium announced to her audience that she sensed the presence of a young man. Rose spoke up to inquire if it could be her son, Harold, who had been killed in an explosion. The medium said that it was, and that Harold resembled her. She mentioned she saw the number 3 and suggested that might mean Harold had suffered for 3 hours or 3 days.
Or
She
3 minutes. Or
from the
3
explosion.
seconds.
Died in an explosion, but could have suffered for 3.
Talk about grasping at straws. Jeez.
Yeah, like, I don't know. Maybe, like, figure out your continuity issues before you say this shit. She told Williamson she saw a large A over his head and asked if he sometimes saw white forms. Now familiar with the procedure, Williamson answered that he did, and the medium told him he had extraordinary powers. When they inquired about their baby, who needed an operation, the medium assured them both that everything would be all right. She said the baby was nervous, but she saw an old woman with hair parted in the middle. Rose identified this woman as an aunt, who would watch over the baby. Of course, Harold, the baby, and the aunt were all fictitious. As entertaining as the series in the Chicago Tribune was to read, Rose's intention when she met with E.W. Williamson was to provide clear examples of the tricks and techniques fraudulent mediums were using to take advantage of vulnerable people. The need for answers, reasons, and even something or someone to blame is normal under challenging times, especially when worried or grieving. It is human nature to seek explanations. After over 20 years as an investigator, Rose knew she could not stop people from visiting mediums. She was fully aware the susceptible people were all too vulnerable to the slightest suggestion that they might speak again to their dead. She sought, as she always had, to educate. By describing what went on in salons, seance rooms, and spiritualist meetings, her goal was not to tell people categorically to avoid spiritualists. After all, she remained agnostic, but to arm the public with a healthy sense of skepticism if they chose to explore spiritualism. And that's my story.
That was great. I brought the sadness and you brought the humor.
Somebody had to do a palate cleanse.
Yeah, I love that woman. I wish I could shake her hand.
Yeah, Rose Mackenberg was a queen. We have no choice but to stand. She was out here trying to save people from getting taken advantage of and exploited all throughout the land.
Well, Sannah, I loved that. I loved it. Every second. Heck yeah.
Rose Mackenberg, private investigator of fraudulent mediums. But it's cool they had like an actual medium in their team. So they had at least one medium that they trusted to be legit. So they weren't completely writing everybody off.
Right.
That medium had to work for years to establish their credibility, is what I'm
She
thinking.
wanted answers.
Yeah.
Well, way to go, Sannah. I reckon that's our show.
That is our show. I'm hungry and I need to do something about it.
Go get you that salmon.
I'm about to make some salmon.
Oregon inspired Sannah to make salmon for the rest of her life.
I would love to say that it was Oregon, but I love having salmon, and it's like the only thing I can eat right now.
So. I'm on an all salmon diet. God, Karen, you're so stupid. All right, y'all. Thanks for listening. We'll see you soon next time.
And don't forget to stay shook.
Thank you so much for tuning into Shook. New episodes of Shook drop every other Wednesday on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you love to listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information on today's episode, please check out our show notes. And until next time, stay shook.
Do you have a personal paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? If so, visit our website, shookpodcast.com, and fill out our contact form. Or send us an email at shookparanormalpod@gmail.com.
And one last thing, friends. Shook is a 100% independently produced podcast. So please consider supporting our show by either leaving a review or contributing to our Patreon page. You can find that at patreon.com/shookpodcast.